slight inaccuracy in the title, but it doesn't affect the text of the proposal, which is correct. So this bill is relative to prohibiting, the title says towns, but it would also apply to cities and any other incorporated or otherwise municipal ordinances, from criminalizing the right to peacefully and orderly assemble. Now, some people might say, why do we need this? It is in the state constitution. I agree. I'm tracking the language of the state constitution, specifically Part 1, Article 32, that provides people the constitutional right in New Hampshire to assemble in a peaceful and orderly manner. So the reason this is needed is my interpretation of that law and I guess judges' interpretation of when that applies are slightly at odds. So by way of background, this bill is primarily in response to the town of Newfield that did not like people petitioning and protesting outside of the governor's house. In the case, numerous people were arrested. At least two of those people, I believe, are here. At least one testifying, I'm not sure about both of them. But in that case where people were arrested, they were engaged in a peaceful and orderly protest. It was a silent vigil. People were walking outside in public on the sidewalks. No traffic was inhibited. They weren't loud, making noises, or otherwise disrupting things. I filed a motion to dismiss, arguing various constitutional protections, including, like I said, Article 32, but also, in that case, when it applied to a government official, arguably the highest government official in the state, I think it's further protection under right petition. Ultimately, the court denied our motion to dismiss. Everyone who was charged with that ordinance was found not guilty. In our particular case, we didn't really even present a defense at trial, hoping that it would go up to appeal to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, validating the statute. So trying to, I guess, cut this off by legislative means. So this statute, I do define an orderly manner, and the way I'm open to any type of redefining orderly manner, but I think various parts of the disorderly conduct statute that already defines things that I would consider orderly or disorderly. So if this were passed, people still can't obstruct traffic. They can't obstruct entrances. They can't breach the peace. They can't be inconvenient, annoying, make loud noises, disrupting conduct or assemblies, those types of things. So when it applied to things like riots, that certainly would still be prohibited. I didn't actually define peaceful in this, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So I think it's difficult to imagine every type of instance that could in fact be peaceful or not. So certainly things that would be prohibited would be what courts consider true threats. So true threats are outside constitutional protection. I guess the easiest example of a true threat is if I say I'm going to kill someone. So clearly someone cannot go outside anywhere and just have a sign saying I'm going to kill or attack or someone's name. I think any court would certainly find that outside of any type of constitutional protection. It would be criminal threatening, in fact. So this wouldn't actually legalize that. But like I said, the reason I didn't define peaceful specifically is it's just, I think, hard to imagine every type of thing dealing with that. Also, the courts regularly, or at least as far as the Supreme Court, regularly addresses what constitutes a true threat. So in some circumstances, it's kind of a gray area whether it's a constitutional protected right. So this term, even the Supreme Court, the U.S.
Yes, you kind of alluded to it, but many of the same individuals involved in the Newfields protest, I guess, were also arrested in, I'm not sure whether it would have been Goffstown or Manchester, whatever side of the town line. New Hampshire Institute of Politics is in the Executive Council chambers. So would your bill apply to meetings such as things such as Executive Council meetings, or where's the line between what this bill covers and what it doesn't?
Yes, I guess I'd have to see what the complaint alleges. So if the complaint's alleging that people are acting in a disorderly fashion, so if you were if a bunch of people came in and started interrupting this proceeding, I don't think that would count as an orderly manner under our present statute. Specifically, 3 already deals with breach of peace, inconvenience, annoyance, including loud noises and specifically disrupting. In those particular facts, I would say no, it would not prohibit that. But if people were outside of that place with some signs picketing, I would suggest yes, those people should not be charged with a crime.
Thanks.
Yes, Representative Manos.
What was the basis for the motion to dismiss, for the allowance of the motion to dismiss?
The U.S. Supreme Court has a law that on its face, that this law on its face would be constitutional. I think it's distinguishable. I did try to distinguish it. So the case that the U.S. Supreme Court relied on basically allowed under limited circumstances people to be criminalized for essentially protesting in a residential neighborhood. I think the statute as applied was different because it was directed at the governor. So the basis of the dismissal was that specific U.S. Supreme Court case. And I would add that U.S. Supreme Court basically sets the minimum standards. New Hampshire, we have our own constitution, specifically Article 32 addresses this.
More protective.
More protective, yes.
Other questions? So I just want to make sure I'm, so what court was this that denied the motion to dismiss? Was it Superior Court or Judiciary Court?
It was District Court.
And was there an opinion written by the court?
Yes, there was, and I will submit that to you.
Saying that that it was not unconstitutional.
Yes, at the motion to dismiss stage, and a lot of my arguments applied to the essentially. I think the main thing the court was finding was that it was constitutional on its own face, but the court might be deferred on the as applied and wanted to wait to the point of trial to address that issue. So ultimately, it wasn't, well, it was addressed in trial with a not guilty verdict, but there wasn't any specific finding after trial or after testimony as to whether it was constitutional as applied to the case.
So I guess I have one other question. Under this, if we were to enact this as a law, suppose that whether it's in Newfields or wherever, anywhere, suppose that people are unhappy with some person who lives at a particular address and they decide that they're going to walk a picket line peacefully and quietly at 2 o'clock in the morning. Can they do that?
I think if it's peacefully and quietly, yes. If it's disrupting people, either with, and it doesn't have to be noise, I guess if it were even sounds, I would suggest that that's still inconvenience. The court could take into consideration the time of night, people don't want light shined into their house, or if you're somehow awakening people, I would suggest that would still be some type of breach of peace or inconvenience or annoyance. So I think it would depend on the specific facts, but I think if someone's just walking quietly outside of someone's house while they're sleeping, I don't as written, apply, and I argued also that the ordinance was broad, because it included things that they also can include, but for the facts of the matter, no, it was on public property, the sidewalk, very factually specific to the governor's house. Is there is a private right-of-way that goes along his property, basically among, sort of dividing his property between things. So there was no trespassing, I guess. So this wouldn't prevent trespassing. That's it. Way to answer your question. So it would only apply to public. You can't go on someone's front yard and start protesting.
Okay, thank you. That was the question is this seems like it only applies to public land, and I wanted to
Yes.
make sure that that was the case. Thank you.
Other questions for this witness? Yes, Representative Turk.
Yeah, and this may be my lack of understanding of the law. I'm understanding that the Constitution essentially encompasses what the law that you're proposing is also trying to encompass, and I would assume that a constitutional provision would supersede. So is this just related to the way that the court applied the law, and is there any other instance where we sort of have a law that sort of codifies something that's in the Constitution?
I guess I am, yes, used to it being the other way around, but in this case, the town passed an ordinance knowing about the Constitution. Many people, at least I think it was like 7 or 8 people on that specific night, were arrested for violating an ordinance. So police didn't think it violated the Constitution. Ultimately, an attorney filed a motion to dismiss, arguing it violated the Constitution. The judge disagreed with me. So maybe I'm the outlier, but numerous people are just finding that the specific, at least the statute itself, did not violate the Constitution. So I don't think I can further amend the Constitution to make it clear. So, but we can make it clear specifically when it's being applied to a town. The state is well within its authority to preempt towns telling you cannot do that. I hope I answered your question.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Representative Turk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. You may have said what the people that were protesting were charged with, but I may not have been listening or I didn't write it down. Could you repeat that, please?
Yes, I will submit the actual complaint in text of Newfield's town ordinance, but basically it was prohibiting, I forget to use the word protest, I believe it's protest, it might have been assembly, but essentially protesting outside of a residential area. That's essentially their broad statute. It didn't include any limitations. Obviously every law, town ordinance, or otherwise is limited by the Constitution, but it's a very broad statute. Basically said, don't protest in any manner outside of a residence.
Thank you. Hello?
Yes.
So you have written testimony that you're going to be giving us?
Yes, I will submit that. And the reason I didn't do it ahead of time is I try to listen to everyone else's comments and so I can add further to testimony that will be submitted. But I will submit the town ordinance in question. My motion is dismissed that I filed as well as the court's order in that case.
Thank you.
Yes, Representative Perez.
Thank you for taking my question. Does that ordinance appear to be in direct violation of the Constitution?
In my opinion, yes.
Okay. Is anything being done about that ordinance?
It can't be at this point because it's moot because everyone was found not guilty. So this is my response to making something being done about it.
May I?
Yes.
So, in other words, the ordinance still stands in that particular town. So if that ordinance was in my town and I went and peacefully assembled outside of my next door neighbor's house, which is a residence, I could be arrested if I stepped off the sidewalk onto the street.
First your town would have to pass an ordinance, assuming
Right.
they,
I'm saying maybe.
yes, assuming they use the language that the US Supreme Court allowed. I think, yes, I would agree
do it didn't stop them from putting in that town ordinance, how would this RSA stop them from having that ordinance? What's different here?
Yep, two ways. I think it just broadly clarifies an affirmative defense, but second, so towns can only do what the state allows them to, and one thing is what's called preemption. So we have various statutes that do that, off the top of my head, firearms being one of them. We specifically tell towns you cannot address any law dealing with this. So if the legislature comes in and specifically tells a town or city you cannot do this, of course, I don't think there's any question. I don't even think the town would try.
Thank you.
Other questions for this witness? Yes, Representative Di Lorenzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one quick one, Representative Hines. Who defines peacefully and orderly assemblance?
Yeah, so, I mean, ultimately, I had to make a judgment call on that. If the, and like I said, I didn't want to limit it, so, if courts were to, like I said, you still have constitutional right to do that, so I'm happy with any, changes that the committee might feel is a better way to do it, so I just didn't define peacefully because I think it's hard to encompass everything that might include that. And orderly, this is in the disorderly conduct statute, so I tried to pick things in the statute that I thought were disorderly and we might not otherwise want to allow. So it was just me guessing at what I feel includes those things, but if the committee wants to make any changes to those language, I would certainly support that.
Other questions for this witness? Thank you very much, Representative Hines.
Thank you.
I'm next going to call on Frank Negus. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly.
Negus.
Staples?
Negus.
Staples.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Staples.
Apologize for my comments there. I would like to put the board on notice for the people that I do have head trauma, and I get loud sometimes and distracted, so I may need a little bit more time. There's a lot of things here that you guys were asking Attorney Hines that he's not aware of. I am the organizer of the original protests in front of the governor's house. No one ever stepped foot on his property. There is a public cul-de-sac in the cul-de-sac where he lives. There's a small park right there in that cul-de-sac. And that's where all of the protests were held, and that's where the candlelight vigil was held, where Skylar Bennett was arrested for trespassing and disorderly conduct. The governor used that arrest that he was found not guilty of to cancel his inauguration and publicly state that there were armed protesters in his backyard, which was a lie, a bold-faced lie. Additionally, his brother, Michael Sununu, is the one who passed this town ordinance. The town ordinance itself derives its power from a motorboat muffler statute, okay? It's right there in the town ordinance. And the town ordinance itself does not define what is picketing. It's picketing in a residential neighborhood is the town ordinance, okay? I've been to the police station, the Newfields Town Hall, to ask them, what is picketing? The officer directed me to come back. I went back, and I actually bumped into Michael Sununu. I have a video of the entire encounter. And he was unable to explain what is picketing, where I could and couldn't picket in Newfields. And he said we were allowed to picket, but we should talk to the chief of police. I tried to talk to the chief of police. I got part of the conversation. He called me. I have part of that on video. He's unable to define. He keeps referring to this denial of the motion to dismiss from Attorney Hines to justify this town ordinance, even though Skylar Bennett was ultimately found not guilty. They're referring to the denial of this on the constitutional grounds of that case. So, and another thing, if it isn't disorderly conduct, which is pretty much a catch-all for anything, if it's not disorderly, then it has to be orderly by nature, okay? So if you can't be arrested for disorderly, then they shouldn't, this ordinance is absolutely ridiculous. And when I represented myself at trial, I have this on video as well, State Trooper Dodds testified that AG at the time, McDonald, gave them instructions on how to enforce the ordinance. Okay, what were those instructions? We don't know. I've been trying to find clarity on this. The last person to get a ticket stood in the cul-de-sac by himself while there was a train of vehicles with Dawn Bulldog honking around the cul-de-sac, making noise, flags waving, driving back and forth, back and forth. None of them got in trouble. None of them got ticketed. My friend Brian got ticketed for picketing in front of the governor's house, and then that case was eventually dismissed, and he was never even received notice of it. And that's when we went to Newfields to try to get clarity. So I also have a Supreme Court appeal that McDonald had to recuse himself of because I was arrested for disorderly conduct after the fact. I went back after the vigil. It's fine. I told you I'm disabled, so I'm asking for a reasonable accommodation. Thank you. So we went back, and I was arrested. After I was ticketed, there was at least 10 or 15 of us singing Christmas carols in the middle of the day, and they said, we're all going to get tickets. And then there's state police and the town police talking to each other. I got it all on video. And we're waiting. We go back, we say, hey, where's these tickets? They give me a ticket, only me a ticket. I say, okay. And then I try to get this state trooper next to him who's plain clothes with a mask on to identify himself because he was the one that this guy was talking to. I said, who are you, sir? Identify yourself. And then this Newfields Town Hall guy arrests me for disorderly conduct. Doesn't tell me any lawful order to stop what I'm doing.
Sir, you know, we want to hear what you have to say, but you seem, it needs to be related to this bill.
It is related to this bill.
Well,
This bill stems
wait,
from...
Hang on, you have to listen to me when I'm talking.
Sure.
Okay? All right? It seems like you're going into, you know, sort of the particulars of your case that kind of go beyond what's...
No, because you were asking about the previous protests. Never were there any arrests for disorderly at any of the previous protests, which were supposedly so loud and boisterous. Never once. Okay? Instead, they decided to create this town ordinance off of a motorboat muffler law built for the waterways to target picketing in a residential neighborhood. Okay? So this law is nullified. It is unconstitutional and it cannot be enforced. That's why the judge keeps finding everyone not guilty, and that's why they had to arrest me for disorderly conduct for nothing, for peacefully protesting and then asking why who this guy is who's giving the town police instructions on how to enforce this law. So this is a criminal conspiracy, and there should be a 100% investigation on this. I will email the video of the encounter that I had with Michael Sununu, where he's the one who signed off on this town ordinance. If anyone could explain it, he can, but he couldn't.
Okay, all right.
So if you have any questions, and I would like to hark back to Governor Wentworth. This is historical facts of New Hampshire. Look up Governor Wentworth, the first governor of New Hampshire. Do you know what happened to him? Protesters came outside his house with a cannon. And he took off out the back door and he went to Canada and never came back. Okay? So protesting in front of our political representatives, our public servants' houses to hold them accountable is what it's all about. If we're out in front of your house because we know where you live, and that's not a threat, that's a matter of public record. Okay? We know where you live. If we're outside your house pissed off, there's a reason for it. And maybe you should listen to the people who you're supposed to represent.
All right, questions for this witness? Anyone have any questions? Yes, Representative Orr.
You've referred several times to Michael Sununu, so what office, what position of authority did he hold in the town of Newfields or wherever?
He's the town administrator.
Thank you.
Thank you. He should have recused himself as being the brother of Michael Sununu, and the Sununu administration at the time reached out to the town. We have that proven. New Hampshire Journal proved that. And there was a reporter who's here, a reporter who was covering the vigil. He was arrested and charged as well. And that is unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable.
Other questions for this witness? Yes, Representative Perez.
Thank you. So, may I simplify this and tell me if I'm wrong? It's my understanding that this bill is being put forth because you and others feel that your constitutional rights were violated by an ordinance that was put into place that perhaps prohibited your constitutional rights from being allowed. Is that simple?
As far as I understand it, I'm not Dan Hines, he's the one who put the bill forward. This bill is put forward to, I mean, it's rewriting the Constitution. This is the problem. We already have the Constitution that's not being followed, and we are whittling it away with all these statutes. We need less and less and less of these statutes to have more freedom. Laws create crime. Simple math. 0 laws equals 0 crime. I'm not advocating for 0 laws, but that's how it works. So you can't criminalize everything that you don't like, especially if there's a disorderly conduct statute that's there that can be used. They could have arrested anybody for disorderly conduct at any time.
Other questions for this witness? All right, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Notch Grays?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nate Grays for the Municipal Association. I can't remember if I've introduced myself before this year. It's been a little busy. We are a voluntary membership organization comprised of the 234 cities and towns of New Hampshire. We provide legal advice to cities and towns. We provide training. We did about 80 training and education events last year. We also come here and advocate on behalf of cities and towns. We are opposed to this bill. It appears to be a limit on the ability of municipalities to regulate the time, place, and or put into place time, place, and manner restrictions on, I guess, public gatherings. These type of restrictions have been litigated extensively over many, many decades. Our New Hampshire Supreme Court has addressed this multiple times. We have very clear case law about that. And we believe that those judicial decisions are correct. We don't believe that it is appropriate to upend the apple cart and change what the existing law is. As I understand from the discussion today, this bill was filed as a consequence of some enforcement actions taking place in Newfields. I'm not familiar with those, so I wouldn't want to speak to those specifically. I'm unclear at this point in time whether the bill sponsor indicated that he had asked the court for an as-applied challenge to that ordinance. An as-applied challenge is one where essentially the defense, and please correct me if I'm wrong on describing this, Representative Lynn, but an as-applied challenge is one where the defense asks the court to find that the law is written is unconstitutional as applied to the specific facts in that case. Generally speaking, that's a little bit of a lesser standard than an overall challenge to an ordinance, which is a facial challenge, which means that essentially you're saying that this law would never be constitutional in any circumstance. I wasn't exactly clear on the testimony whether that was asked for or not, but I would assume that whatever court documents he files with the committee would clarify that. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Questions for this witness? Yes, Representative Greason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sir, for your taking our questions. Line 3 of the bill, paragraph 2, Roman numeral 7, says, notwithstanding any other provision of law, it shall not be a crime or violation of peacefully assembled. So that clause, notwithstanding any other provision of law, says that municipalities can still enact laws. Your concern as you represent the municipalities is that this would infringe upon their ability to enact laws that govern times and places of
protests. Notwithstanding any other provision of law says that these municipalities can still enact such laws. So how is this bill then, and additionally, all of the rulings, if I understand, have determined that the ordinance that was put into place, they were all found not guilty. So there's clearly a problem with that law. So how would this then infringe upon a municipality's ability to regulate times and places of assembly?
So as I mentioned, I'm not familiar with the cases.
Well, irrespective of that, how would this, because it says notwithstanding any other provision of law.
So that's what might also create some additional confusion, because there is, for instance, RSA 3139, which allows municipalities to put in place municipal ordinances on very specific things. And, you know, if there, and that will be enacted at town meeting, this is the town meeting, generally proposed by the select board. And it's possible there would be some sort of overlap there where there's some sort of authority granted by that law for municipalities to put in ordinances that may run differently from how this law reads. And I am slightly confused with a lack of definitions for the term peaceful, for instance, as well as line 6 and 7 that say orderly manner means not engaging in conduct prohibited under paragraph 2C or 3, what exactly that encompasses. It's a
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
So where in law is peaceful defined? And if there's a reference for this section, orderly manner refers to other portions of the law. I'm assuming that it refers back to disorderly conduct. I don't know the law specifically, but it's at least referring to something that's been codified. How is then peaceful defined so that any judge would then know this is the standard for peaceful?
I'm not aware of any statutory definition of the term peaceful.
But you're asking them to define it.
I'm not the one proposing the law, sir.
But you just said you don't know what peaceful is.
Well, that's why I'm pointing that out, because it's not defined in the bill in front of you. So I don't exactly know how that would be understood by the courts. It appears.
Don't they understand it
Yeah,
now?
let's not turn this into a debate. I think
I'm sorry.
questions are okay. No, I'm directing it to both parties. All right. Other questions? So I guess I do have one question. Let's assume that you're correct that the New Hampshire Constitution would allow municipalities to regulate the time, at the time, place, and manner of protests in a way that would not be allowed under this statute. I guess my question, though, so this statute then would provide more protection than the Constitution provides. And I guess my question is, let's assume that all that's true, that a municipality could now prohibit some types of protests or demonstrations, whatever, that they would not be able to provide if this statute was enacted. So I guess my question, though, is, so what? I mean, why isn't this statute still a good idea if it's limited as it's worded to say to being peaceful protests?
Well, we do advocate for municipalities to maintain their existing authority, and we believe that given the volume of case law related to what municipalities may and may not do in this area that currently exists, that was an appropriate decision by our Supreme Court over the course of many decades, refining that, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's our position. Is we think that's the appropriate answer. Is the courts have decided, and their decision was correct.
Okay, no, that's fine. Question, yes, Representative Perez.
Thank you. I apologize. We have a lot of people who are very knowledgeable on the law. I was a nurse for 42 years. So are you saying that Hampshire Constitution allows for freedom of speech. If a town says, yeah, but you can only do it this, this, and this, the town's allowed to do that?
So maybe it's easier if I give you an example.
Sure.
So if you at the town level were to say, hey, something's a good idea, I don't know, you're gonna ban, let's say you're gonna ban nuclear weapons from your town, right? Some town actually did this. You could pass a town ordinance that does that. Now, whether that prevents the US government from setting up a missile silo in your town with a nuclear weapon in it is totally irrelevant, because you can't override law, because towns are subdivisions of the state, and they can't override state laws, they can't override federal laws that would be applied through the supremacy clause, and they certainly can't override either the New Hampshire or the US constitutions. So, in understanding what the US and New Hampshire constitutions mean, the attorneys assisting the towns have to rely on court decisions, Supreme Court decisions mainly, to understand the words used in those, because they have very specific meanings which have been clarified over centuries at this point. So it may be possible for a town to do something which is unconstitutional, and I'm not saying nuclear weapons is a great example for this, but they could do something like that, and that would violate some sort of state or federal law. Someone with standing, meaning they have the ability to challenge that law, could come in, sue and say, hey, you can't enforce this. This isn't a lawful ordinance. And then the court would look at that, and they would make a determination about whether it was lawful or not, and based on both the existing state and federal statutes as well as the appropriate constitutions. And if the court found that it was not lawful, and in this case constitutional, which is question, then that ordinance would not be allowed to be enforced. It may still technically be on the books, but it's not enforceable. And there would be a clear judicial decision on that. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Representative Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for taking my question. Isn't any law or statute that's repugnant to the Constitution null and void pursuant to Marbury versus Madison?
You are correct that.
Thank you.
Representative Bork.
I'm sure I'm not unique in this, but I've had a couple occasions where people have been threatening or at least harassing me because they take exception with something I said, which was for their special attention, because I was a state rep. But what power do municipalities have to just protect anybody who's a target of harassment or threatening, whether or not they're public officials? So they have any? Because I know when I had these incidents, I did contact the police department. They just said all we agreed to is that they keep an extra eye on my house and send patrol cars for it. If anybody was loitering around, they would try to stop them from loitering. So is that something the municipalities actually have authority to do under some law?
Representative Morgan, are we talking about this bill? I mean,
Yes. Oh well, yes, I am.
All right.
I mean that is part of it. Is that Governor Sununu had displeased a number of people in the community, and they were expressing their displeasure in that particular spot, which apparently is allegedly public property. Probably was, but does the municipality have any specific authority to sort of prevent people from congregating or loitering or harassing somebody who, for whatever reason, has attracted the ire of a group of individuals? I'm not sure if this makes any sense.
No. So I'm trying to think about how to frame this. So the government can't control what you say, except in very, very specific manners. So for instance, you can't go in a crowded theater and shout fire when there's no fire, because that creates a hazard. But they can regulate the time, place, and manner for a public gathering. So for example, the government could prevent people from, closing down Main Street or the highway to have a protest, because that's going to be dangerous, or because people are not gonna know, drivers are not gonna know if somebody's gonna hit by a car. That's not a good thing to do. So generally speaking, that's pretty widely accepted and understood. When you get into specific facts, as it appeared to be the motivation behind this particular legislation, that's going to depend on the exact facts and circumstances of the case as they relate to the law that exists now, and the best entity to decide how that applies is the judicial branch. They have expertise in that, and they can apply the law and make those judgments. That's what they're there for.
Other questions for this witness? All right, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Chris Maidman.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify here today. I know we're over time, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. For the record, my name is Chris Maidman. I am here in my personal capacity today as a resident of Peterborough and a citizen of New Hampshire. In December of 2020, I was employed as a reporter for New Hampshire Journal, an online news source here in New Hampshire. We had broken the story of the ordinance in Newfields that had passed the select board there after 3 readings. And following us breaking that story the night in question that several other speakers mentioned, the candlelight vigil was organized, and we had spoken with the state police and the Newfields police ahead of time, and they had promised aggressive enforcement of this new ordinance, which turned out to be absolutely true. I was cited that evening, as well as the protesters were, with the violation of that town ordinance. And I have the text of that ordinance. I know somebody asked about that. The ordinance read, "It is unlawful for any person to engage in picketing before or about the residence or dwelling of any individual in the town of Newfields." Simple one-line statement. The Attorney General's office helped Newfields draft this ordinance. They determined that it would be constitutional. The courts clearly agreed with that, as there was an as-applied challenge, as the previous speaker was wondering. The courts basically ignored the as-applied challenge in this case, at least in my case. So they did not render a decision on whether it was constitutional as applied or not. But clearly the motion to dismiss was denied in all of the cases, and all cases did proceed to trial except mine after 18 months. My case was null prost in May of 2022 rather. So whereas the courts have found that this is a constitutional ordinance, this statute would be necessary in order to prevent towns or cities from passing similar ordinances that criminalize Granite Staters' right to protest. Now, keep in mind, in 2020, we were in the midst of COVID. The State House was largely closed to the public. Representatives that were serving at the time were serving from home mostly. The LOB was largely closed to the public. So the government normally, where people would go to redress their grievances or to protest certain happenings by the government, those buildings were closed. And I'm not condoning protesting in front of somebody's home, but when I spoke to the protesters at the time as a reporter, they had indicated that they had no other place to protest except for the home where the governor was working from. He wasn't working from the State House at the time, and that their position was that they were trying to protest his actions. He wasn't in the State House, so they couldn't protest at the State House. So they brought the protest to his quiet residential neighborhood. Another question that I heard a couple times is what defines peaceful? I would posit that the right question is what defines disorderly. I think if we were to try to define peaceful, it would be a very long list of what constitutes peaceful activity. But Chapter 644-2, which is where this statute would be placed if it passes, defines disorderly conduct. All of those statutes would still be in place. The police would still be able to enforce those statutes. They would be able to arrest or remove people that were acting disorderly. Specifically, this bill mentions paragraph 2C, which refers to obstructing vehicular or pedestrian traffic on any public street or sidewalk or the entrance to any public building. And it also references paragraph 3, which talks about breaches of the peace, loud and unreasonable noises, annoyances, threats, or disrupting the lawful assembly or meeting of persons with lawful authority. So if somebody were to come in here and make loud noises and disrupt the business of this committee, that is defined in Chapter 644-2 as disorderly conduct. And that would also apply to executive council meetings, for example, or any other government meeting, select board, what have you. So this really only prevents towns from criminalizing the peaceful and lawful assembly of people as defined in the United States Constitution, First Amendment, and as well as the New Hampshire Constitution. And whereas the courts have agreed that the ordinance passed by Newfields is constitutional, this statute would be necessary if the legislature saw fit to prevent more ordinances like that or to nullify the Newfields ordinance. Like I said, I know we're over, so I'll wrap it up there, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions for this witness? Yes, Representative Turner.
Yeah, hopefully this question's appropriate for you. It probably could have been directed at anyone. I guess what I'm struggling with is, does this really hinge on the question of whether or not the court case challenging this was rightly or wrongly decided by the courts? And essentially, if I'm getting it right, it could have worked its way up through the system, but was sort of nullified by the fact that everyone was acquitted. In other words, that versus needing a new law versus the application of the constitutional provision.
Thank you for the question. Because all the defendants were found not guilty, my case was no prost, but that did stop the appeals process. You can't appeal a not guilty verdict. I mean, you could, but that'd be kind of weird, right? So it's not able to go up to the state Supreme Court to definitively decide the constitutionality, but the district court in this case did deny the motion to dismiss, which had the as-applied challenge in it, and they ignored that provision. So they didn't necessarily say that this was constitutional, but the interpretation of their order could be construed that they had decided that this was constitutional even as applied. So this law would just clarify for any future cases, any possible future cases, that towns do not have the right to criminalize peaceful and lawful assembly.
Just one quick follow-up.
Sure.
So what would be your thought about, you talked about if something like this were to come up again, would this situation be essentially processed by a case that did make its way up the system and was ultimately decided versus passing a new law?
Thank you for the question. I am not a lawyer, so I can't speak definitively to what you're saying. I'm sure perhaps Chairman Lynn could answer that for you as a former Supreme Court justice, and I defer to him on that matter.
You know, can I ask this question? Did either in the court's opinion in that case, or if you know, in the prosecution's brief or memorandum to the court, was there any reference made to in the decision to the fact that there was that COVID played a role in the court's decision? The fact that there was there anything, for example, like saying, people who are protesting peacefully in front of the governor's house at a time of COVID, they're going to be too close to each other, there might be some health issues. Was there anything in the court's decision, predicating its decision in any way on the COVID situation?
I would have to reread it to answer that for you definitively. I don't recall off the top of my head. I don't think so. But I will reread that, and I'd be happy to submit the documents that I have that my lawyer prepared for my case to the committee as well.
All right. Other questions? Yes, Representative Di Lorenzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, on the day that you were arrested in Newfields, were you there as a reporter or as a member of the public?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I was there in my official capacity as a reporter for New Hampshire Journal, and I identified myself to the police as such.
Other questions? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to call on Jason Gerhardt, Representative Jason Gerhardt.
Good morning. Thank
Welcome.
you. Thank you, committee. I was actually one of the participants that was there that night that the tickets were issued. So 8 people were issued tickets, 1 was arrested. And the importance of this legislation is just to reiterate we have to stick to the Constitution. We have to make it very clear that no matter what office you possess in this government, state, country, people can still express themselves and their concerns to you. Because let's go back in time to when this all was going down. The governor cancels his inauguration. So I believe it was that night, actually. The candlelight vigil was planned. The vigil was for the victims of the lockdown. So people that were suffering from drug overdoses, suicides. This really messed a lot of people up. People that were already on the edge, the whole COVID thing kind of pushed them off. Now, we could argue that it was necessary and all that, and I think events have proven that to be not true. But point being, I don't know if we were way over time, so I just want to make this quick. And if anybody has questions about the actual night's events, but the heavy-handed nature of the whole situation was just insane. I mean, you had to be there. There's some videos, and Frank's a little bit out there, but he means well. It was surreal. I mean, we're just there walking down the walkway that does abut his property, but it's on public property. It's a right of way to this country store down the street. And next thing you know, all these state troopers show up with the riot gear on. It felt like Hunger Games. You know, I had the shields, I mean, it was so unnecessary. And I understand it's to make a point, to send a message, and all that. But where are we going to go from here? If you can't protest, and it was a candlelight vigil. There was no signs. There was nothing because you don't want the picketing issue. It was really for the victims of the lockdown. So, if any questions, I don't want to ramble on and on. I know you got to be on time, but
Questions for this witness? Can I just ask her? Well, I have one question. Do you know, has there been any effort within the town of Newfields to repeal the ordinance?
no. I think doing so would then put them at liability of lawsuits. Well, they're already on lawsuits, but if they say that, okay, this is a bad idea, now it's, oh, okay, now you're admitting such.
All right, any other questions? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
All right. I'm sorry, anybody else wishing to testify on HB 164? All right, seeing none, I'm going to close the hearing on 164.